My name is Michelle Lavoie. I'm the director of PICUM, which is the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants. We're very happy to be here today, even though technically we can't see each other yet. Unfortunately, that's actually part of the whole issue of irregular migration is the invisibility of the issue. But we're very happy to be part of this webinar series. This is the first one today in a joint series looking at various research consortia that are looking at irregular migration. And here I would actually like to say that the starting point for a lot of these irregular migration research consortia was maybe the fact that there was a very big research project that was funded around 13 years ago called Clandestino, which some of us in the call today were involved in as partners, and that provided estimates of undocumented migrants residing in the EU at the time. At the time, it was said it was perhaps between 2 to 4 million undocumented migrants in the EU. And once that project finished, that was very helpful to have those estimates, but then they soon became outdated. And in the meantime, irregular migration itself has climbed to the top of the EU's agenda. Migration is a key part of the EU's strategic priorities, and irregular migration is a very prominent part as well. And so the policy focus has increased, the number of stakeholders working on the issue have also increased, and there is constantly a need for more data, more estimates of undocumented, but also more objective information about the living and working conditions of undocumented migrants in the EU. And so over the years, many stakeholders advocated for more research funding. And finally, DG Research launched a call, well, several calls actually, some years ago. And now we have 7 research consortia that are looking specifically at irregular migration. And today, in this webinar series, we're going to be hearing about 4 of them. One is called MIRAM, which looks at data and estimates of undocumented and regularization. And the other 3 we will be hearing in the panel right after we hear about the presentation from MIRAM. The other 3 are Dignity Firm, iClaim, and Prime. And in addition to the 4 that we will be looking at today in this webinar, there are 3 other research consortia looking at return and reintegration. And so we're very happy to have the coordinators of these consortia today on the webinar here with you to kind of highlight some of the key focus points of these consortia and to shed a little bit of light on how these consortia will be addressing various issues on irregular migration. So I would like to now turn it over to our host today, Albert Krahler from the University for Continuing Education Krems, who is the coordinator of the MIRAM project. To start us off with kind of the concepts and also looking at the estimates of undocumented migrants. So Albert, I guess the question that we'd like to address to you is, how can we conceptualize irregular migration? What does the MIRAM consortia aim to do in terms of estimates of undocumented migrants in Europe? And how will regularization be considered within the MIRAM project?
Well, thanks a lot for these questions, and apologies for the technical difficulties. So I think we just have to live with the fact that we are without videos. Anyways, we will just continue like this. It's more like a radio program now, a podcast. And turning to the question by Michelle, I think generally, and many of you will be aware as regular media consumers and participants in political debates, that there is irregular migration is evoked in public debates in an often elusive way as a specter that underpins securitized debates on migration more generally, and is often based on stereotypical images of irregular migrant either as a villain or a victim. What is missing in these accounts are both the nuances of a wide range of different constellations of migrant irregularity and the mechanisms and why people find themselves in irregular situations of different kinds. So that was one of the starting points for the Miriam project that we set out to really try to think about the different constellations in which people find themselves in an irregular status or in some other kind of precarious status. And I will show a slide now that basically portrays our, that presents our conceptual framework. You should see it now. It's actually it's not entirely original. We are starting off from the project that Michelle also already mentioned in her introduction, the Clandestino project, and looking with a demographic lens at the population of migrants in an irregular situation. And what the Clandestino project did using an demographic accounting model is basically to look at the the population of irregular residents in a country and try to understand how people turn irregular, how they become irregular, and how they exit irregular. Basically distinguishing between three broad pathways into irregularity: demographic flows, geographic flows, status-related flow, and related pathways out of irregularity. What we try to do in addition is to more systematically think also in terms of what are the differentiations within these categories of this broad group of migrants without an irregular status. And I don't go into that, and I just encourage you also to look at the Miriam website to there's two papers looking at this conceptualization. But the main point really is that one can also with a view of trying to measure and map out what different categories exist. One can differentiate between different categories depending by the degree they are visible and also traced and traceable in public records. And importantly, there are also related categories. Migrants with a provisional status, which are sometimes in the public debate often mixed together or debated together with irregular migrants, and in a sense, for example, debates on international protection, asylum have become debates on irregular migration and vice versa. So it's a very mixed and muddled debate. But it's also and we think it's not enough just to say that, for example, asylum seekers should not be considered as irregular migrants, because in a sense there is a link to irregular migration, given the lack of the absence of legal pathways to admission for persons in need of international protection. And then a certain share of asylum seekers also get rejected and might add to the population of migrants in an irregular status, or conversely end up in yet another provisional kind of category, in a situation where we're still in a return procedure, but where the return is either not enforced or where return is suspended. And they might also benefit from regularization program addressed at them. And finally, we also single out, distinguish mobile EU citizens that have no right of residence, and These are different under the EU legal framework compared to third country nationals. When we talk about irregular migration on the EU level, it's always about third country nationals, but still EU migrants in certain situations might receive a residence ban. For example, if they are in conflict with criminal law, or in their initial period of residence. I think that the important takeaway from that approach that we have taken is that one can undertake a systematic mapping of different situations of migrant irregularity. And so despite all the fluidity and flexibility, people change status constantly throughout their decision trajectories. It's possible to give a snapshot picture of the different constellations of irregularity that exist. What I want to close with here is that there's also other possible ways to conceptualize migrant irregularity. Legal status is just one axis. One of our colleagues also involved in the Miriam project, Maurizio Ambrosini, for example, has come up with a conceptualization of migrant irregularity that looks at the legal axis and an axis of social recognition, which basically shapes the reality, what it means to be in an irregular situation. Just going back to that Miriam scheme of things, I think what one of the purposes of this scheme is that we can also map out on which kind of categories we do have quantitative indicators or estimates, and where we actually know close to nothing. So it helps us to also see where most of the data are focused on, and where we have a gap in terms of knowledge. In general terms, probably what we mostly see is that there's a lot of enforcement data that primarily looks at geographic flows, inflows, and on a lot of the other aspects that are mapped out here in this scheme, we have very limited information. And similarly, from a policy point of view, such a scheme can help also to identify, so what kind of target groups do we actually talk about, and what kind of maybe differentiated policy measures for specific subgroups are required to address the situation of migrants in an irregular status. I close here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Albert. Great to see you. And I would also invite yes, we can now see everyone else on the panel. Great to see you all. So thanks for providing that overview and that diagram, and your comments also at the end in terms of also seeing a diagram like that. It helps us to see where, for example, there is a lot of information. As you said, there's a lot actually on enforcement measures and inflows, and there's not necessarily a lot of data or even estimates on the other kind of situations that you presented in that diagram. I do have some questions for all of the other research coordinators for your various consortia, but before we go into that, I'd just like to ask you, would you like to say anything briefly on what Albert has just presented in terms of the concepts or kind of just this whole conceptual framework that we're looking at? Would any of you like to say anything briefly? Tesselcha, feel free.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity, Michelle and Albert, for the presentation. And indeed, maybe it's just to highlight what Albert noted, is that the notion of irregularity is that it shifts over time, that it's not a status quo, and that people come in regularly and might shift into irregularity, and that this can concern EU citizens just the same. I think that's a very important note. Maybe to add that EU policies, as Albert, as you rightly mention, have this effect, but I think we should also note that they have that effect across the border of the EU. So EU migration policy, but also other policy fields, as I'll elaborate on briefly later on, have the effect of defining a status as regular or irregular, even outside the EU borders. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Tasulcha. Nando?
I guess in our project, what we try to understand is, yes, the conditions of irregularity change. There are multiple factors, multiple forces, people come in and out. But something that we identify as a gap in the literature is why, not the why question. Why we end up with this process of criminalization of different forms of mobility, why some groups end up to be criminalized and others are not. And so this is where we try to add into the debate and shift the focus from the migrants, which end up to be very often people we end up to interviewing and put at the center of the research, to the drivers of this process of irregularization, you know, and then we'll talk later, but this is, I think, what we've tried to do with our project.
Excellent, thank you. Martin, did you have any quick comments before we move on to the next panel?
Not much, just to say that obviously I think it can be a bit overwhelming sometimes for people studying the issue if you're confronted with this multitude of different types of irregularity in the question as well. So how do we study this thing? And so one natural question, I don't know to what extent, Albert, you've done this in your project, is to find out, you know, how much of this can be measured and you know, what do we know about the numbers in each of the categories in Europe? And maybe the only point I would make is that I think if you want to find out about, you know, whether and how status matters, obviously, I think we need then some comparative analysis that we can't kind of, I mean, it's plausible to think that these different types of statuses might have real consequences for the people. So whether or not you have, you know, no legal resident status, or whether you have legal resident status and then you breach the conditions of that status, you could think that might make a difference, but we don't know actually. So I think this emphasis, I think, on comparative analysis, I would say, is quite important. So compare the categories with each other, but also compare to citizens. So to get a sense of, you know, how much of the issues that irregular migrants face are actually to do with their status, as opposed to other factors.
Thanks, Martin. Albert, did you have any quick comments on any of that before we move on to the other panel? No? Okay. So thank you all for mentioning those important points that I think those of us involved in MURM will also take on board, especially Albert, in terms of the coordination. Now I'd like to go on, and before I do that, I should also just recall that anyone in the audience who might have a comment can please feel free to put that in the chat. Ideally, also, if you have a question, if you can put that in the Q&A section, we'll be looking at that towards the end in case there's any questions that are raised that we can address to the panelists. And also, we would invite, if possible, to put the links of the different projects in the chat so that people can have them. They're also embedded on the agenda that you might have seen. So now we want to go to the three new consortia that have started on living and working conditions. And I'd like to invite the coordinators to talk a little bit about how these consortia are different from one another and what's the specific angle that they'll be looking at. So I'd first like to invite Tasulcha de Lange from Radboud University, who's the coordinator of the Dignity Firm project. So Tasulcha, how will Dignity Firm examine the employer demand for irregular migrant workers in the farm to fork industries? And maybe you can explain a little bit about that whole concept of farm to fork. What do you gain in this consortia from having an employer perspective? What becomes a little bit more visible? Please feel free.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michelle, for the questions. And actually, also to Nando and Martin in the previous comments, because indeed it's exactly about drivers and comparing categories, including citizens, that we aim to do with our Dignity Firm project. We focus actually on multiple stakeholders, so migrant workers, stakeholders, EU, national, local level. including employers. And we actually want to know why there is an employer demand for low-wage labor, which often is performed by migrants, but not by definition, going to the point that we need to compare to citizens. And the farm-to-fork sector, we picked that sector because, especially during COVID, it became clear that that's what we call essential work, essential sectors. People putting food on the table, agriculture, food processing, restaurants, etc. So it is key to our livelihood that this work is performed. And you asked us how we go about this research. I think, like many of us, we engage mixed methods, so from surveys to interviews, and policy analysis, legal analysis, and also especially the policy cycle. And maybe on that, I have to say that we go beyond migration policy and migration law. There's relevant migration law at play here, definitely, like the Employer Sanctions Directive, which is a disincentive for employers to engage migrants without legal residence. The Seasonal Workers Directive, which has a positive note as it offers legal pathways. Same for the Single Permit Directive, which is on the topic of the next webinar that we've planned. But we also look at, for instance, policies on public health, on occupational safety and health, because they very much define the working relationship that we're looking at. But maybe even more important and understudied is looking into different fields of law, such as corporate social responsibility law and the responsibilities of business in this respect, with private certification or public means, and farm-to-fork policies is what we focus on. And there, for instance, you see interesting EU legislation on the balancing of power relations between farmers and supermarkets. And that takes us into a whole array of policies that have an impact on why there is this demand, the drivers of this kind of migration. And as long as there's that demand, we assume that there will be people answering it. The public procurement laws, just to mention another one, but also business and sectoral taxes or subsidies, it can all make the demand for low-wage workers, hence often migrant workers. Now, you asked, Michelle, what we gain from this employer perspective that we engage. I think exactly that we raise the awareness that it is not just migration policies that we need to address, because then you're missing the bigger picture. Agricultural policies inside the EU, but also outside, like what the EU demands of how what an orange or a bean from Morocco, what it looks like. Those kind of laws might actually impact a farmer in Morocco to think, oh dear, I need to do something else to meet these requirements, and hence I need to cut costs somewhere. And well, often employment is one of the fields where costs can be cut, although it means cutting corners with regard to the dignity of the workers involved. So this is what we call irregular, the regulatory infrastructure of irregular work, and we are really digging in these different policies. And I think what's interesting is Prime is working with the concept of goal conflicts, and I think together bringing those lenses together will allow for hopefully new policy debates, policy angles to really address holistically, like not just a whole of government approach, but maybe the supply chain approach to why there are migrant workers in precarious labor in the EU and in associated countries, why that is needed, very much coming from the demand side, indeed. Hence, it makes sense to look at employers. And maybe just briefly, you asked how we're going to do that. We're going to engage employers, of course, through surveys, interviews, trying to flesh out from small, medium enterprises to large enterprises to franchises or other ways in which the business end is organized that might impact on their choices and the lack of dignity for the migrant workers or the workers in general that are involved in their supply chains. And I always talking about food and people bringing food to the table and it being touchy that we, of course, maybe this is a lunch session, so I might be spoiling people's lunch. Talking about the hardship that was put into the food that they have on the plate. But I think as researchers and as consumers, we have to be aware of that, and we have to, well, simply put, do something to make it better. Thank you.
Thank you, Tesseltje, for that very informative description of a lot of the key elements of the Dignity Firm project. So once again, really with this employer focus, but especially, as you said, the supply chain approach to why to try to answer this question that the EU Fundamental Rights Agency has also tried over years of its research on severe labor exploitation of migrant workers. So the question of why does Europe need migrant workers in precarious labor? I think it's an excellent framing actually for the whole project. And as you said, looking at so many different actors within employment. So not just looking at the migration context, rightly so, but also the employment context. And those various directives that you also mentioned are very helpful as well as a reference for the EU policy level. I should also add, as PICUM is involved in this particular project, that there's also the participatory action research, the PAR methodology that's also very interesting that we
definitely.
are looking forward to develop. Now I'd like to go to Nando Sigona from the University of Birmingham, who's the coordinator of the iClaim project. So Nando, this particular consortia has the strongest ethnographic perspective of all of these consortia on irregular migration. And your consortia will examine how migrants experience working in critical sectors of the labor market, and also the gendered, the racialized, and the intergenerational impacts of irregularity. So the question is, do you think that bringing in such a multi-focused perspective will bring new direction to the current discussion concerning irregular migration?
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Albert, for organizing the session. It's a pleasure to joining. The iClaim project is co-led by the University of Birmingham and the University of Utrecht, and the PI is Ilse Noniet. I'm the scientific director of the project, and ours is a consortium as all the others with 16 partners and all that. The ethnographic part is certainly central to what we do, and in a way, it's complementary to what Tessa was saying. You know, there is a regulatory infrastructures to regulate irregular work. We want to find out through an ethnographic work, what does it mean? What does it actually mean on the ground? But not just to the migrant workers. What we try to do it through our ethnography, we call it like as a dual ethnography, is an ethnography of the work of the sector, understanding so the position of the irregular work within the way that the sector operates. We work, for example, in the delivery and platform work, try to understand how the specificity of the platform work, in a sense, and when the sector sort of builds its own logic, rely on the kind of exploitable workers, and some of the mechanisms that Tessa was pointing out really create also the condition for migrant work, etc. But the project itself is a mixed methods project. And the other side of the ethnography, just going back to the point, is to understand the role of the work and the work experience in the biography of individual and family. And this is also, I guess, is one of the elements which we bring in to the consortia, this emphasis on the household, on the family, and the way that precarity or status reverberate not just on the person that may be irregular in work, but also other member of the family. So that's what we try to do as well. Just to give a kind of structure to to this few words I'm giving you. So if we got 3 words in our title, improving the conditions of irregularized migrants, etc., etc. So the regularized point is what I said before. The irregularized is a way for us to stress the process by which people become irregular and the forces behind this irregularization. You know, this the same person from the same country in the same job sector at a different place or in a different times will be perfectly regular and legal migrants. In other circumstances, they are no longer the case. So what's happened in the meantime? So the regularization, emphasizing this process of irregularity as a process is really important to us. In terms of the understanding the conditions, which is the way we are framing and the way touching on what Albert was saying before, we use this with this idea of the irregularity assemblage as a way of bringing together these different forces and regulatory regime that interfere. So I'm going to share very quickly the slides just to show, but it takes a second. So okay. So the idea is here, in order to identify this irregular condition, the specificity as a not an abstract condition, but as something which is constructed at the intersection of different regulatory mechanisms. We looked in particular at the immigration system, the labor market, the welfare regimes. And one element that also we brings in is this idea of the narratives and the perception of irregularity. Very often people say, you know, if you are Canadian, a white Canadian person, a white Australian, or in UK, you are basically invisible as an irregular migrant. No one even counts you as an irregular migrant. So while if you may be a black British person, people will look at you and think you are irregular, even if you have a British passport. What we try to understand is to extent to which this narrative and perception, which in a sense embed also processes of racialization, for example, affect the experience of people on the ground. You know, it makes the specific configuration of the irregularity. And here is where, in a sense, the project itself tried to build through the ethnographic work. It's really tried to dig into this condition and really understand how different groups in different places and working in different sectors experience the irregularity. And this is where, for example, the point was mentioned before, it's not just about the way that entry is regulated, but it's also the way that exit is regulated. You are in a country where there is a huge informal sectors and where there is no removals, even if you are found irregular. Is it and all, for example, for people that come from a specific age group or in families, how does it affect their experience? You know, for example, that if you are a single man in your early 20s, you are the group that is targeted by enforcement, particularly if you are black. So we try to understand and disentangle all these dynamics. And the final point, it was about the improving. You know, what do we mean? You know, obviously you can take it on a very sort of generic term, say everyone wants to improve the condition. But what we tried to work out was about a logic for, or we call it a theory of change as well. And here, I think, for example, if you think about the dimension of the narrative, as I mentioned before, one of the things we try to do is to understand what are the narratives, the public, the hegemonic narrative around irregularity and regularization, but also understand and work with the NGOs and activists to understand how do they counter this narrative, analyzing campaign. And we also work with public perception in terms of those survey experiments to see what kind of narrative may be more effective to change some of the assumptions and around what does it mean to be regular to the broader public. That's one of the things we try to do. In our consortium, for each country, we have a civil society organization where, as a partner, there are migrants' rights groups, for example, activists, groups that work in the everyday with migrants with precarious legal status. And we have created this, we call stakeholder groups in each country, where we basically try to really have an understanding both in terms of the country, but also in the specific sectors of the labor market, how they operate and where there may be space for an intervention built on the knowledge that we are going to generate through the project. So that, and that's what we're trying to do.
Great. Thank you so much, Nando. That sounds very exciting. And also just to recall, to kind of complement, you started off by saying which sectors you're looking at. So you're looking at delivery and platform work, and you also will look at the household and the family level.
We are looking at the agricultural sector, and we look at domestic work, but in each country we do 2 sectors. So basically then we have 6 countries, and then we have a matrix in which we will have 3 countries that have the same sector. We can look at comparatively, but also with the idea that we look at the European level as well. So it's not like just an horizontal comparison, it's also a pyramidal one.
Mm-hmm. That will be very helpful. And I think part of the reason also for the joint webinar series is that the broader kind of stakeholders are aware of all of these projects, but then I know there's also a lot of work that's being done by all the coordinators to make sure that the research kind of complements each other when there are sectors that are similar, when there are countries that are looked at that are similar as well. But it was very interesting to hear your presentation and to hear a little bit more about the narratives and the perception, which, as you gave some of these examples of how individuals themselves are seen kind of in a racialized context, and citizens are considered to be undocumented because of this whole situation that we have with the racial discrimination. And so I think your project, especially as you said, is going to unpack a lot of the narratives in some very interesting methodology as well, with the broad stakeholder groups in each country. And also we do have a question probably towards the end on terminology in the Q&A that maybe you and some of the others can also consider, because I think it also builds on narratives. So now I'd like to go to Martin Roos from the European University Institute, who's coordinating the PRIME project or consortium. So Martin, your consortia PRIME will look at how the differences in institutional arrangements, so whether they're from welfare systems, from legal systems, from political systems, how all of these differences impact irregular migration. Can you explain a little bit what you'll be doing in PRIME and how PRIME will explore these issues within your consortia?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Thanks, Albert, for hosting this, and thanks, Michelle, for chairing it. So all of the 3 consortia, in a way, have been asked in one way or another to analyze the conditions of irregular migrants, but then there's also a second part that was in the call, which is and understand the needs of host communities. So this is about both migrants and the host communities. And the starting point of our approach is to take the host community side quite seriously and to basically say that, yes, in order to understand the conditions of irregular migrants, you have to study interests, attitudes, policy preferences of host communities. And as Desleigh mentioned, our kind of opening argument is that European liberal democracies are really faced with a fundamental goal conflict when it comes to the issue of irregular migrants. And it's the goal conflict is grounded in a conflict of values, but then also a conflict of interests. And the conflict is essentially between the goals of controlling immigration, which arguably is part of nation states and which all European countries want to do on the one hand, and universal fundamental rights protections for all peoples on countries' territories. So immigration controls by their very nature are differentiating. They create different categories. They are irregularizing because through laws, they define what is regular and not regular. And they often create hierarchies, whereas the fundamental rights protections have, of course, a very universal outlook, and the idea is that people are equal and all enjoy those fundamental protections. And basically, we argue that we're not suggesting that all European governments have this goal conflict at the forefront when they conduct policies vis-a-vis irregular migrants. We are saying, however, that both these goals are present and embedded into all European liberal democracies in one way or another. So while not every government might have a big priority on protecting fundamental rights for everybody, there are institutions in those democracies that will have some fundamental rights protections built into them. So the point really is that all government responses to irregular migrants, whether we're talking about regularization policies or firewalls or other types of policies, all policies need to manage this goal conflict in one way or another, need to manage this goal. And how this goal conflict is managed has then important consequences for the conditions of irregular migrants. I mean, that's the main argument. So there's surprisingly little research about how European countries understand and respond to this goal conflict, the national differences, and then the impact on migrants. And as many here will know, most research on the conditions of irregular migrants is focused on the role of migration status and the irregular migration, the irregular migrants' characteristics such as gender, ethnicity, and nationality. And then at the same time, most kind of political science work on the host country politics of irregular migration have focused on the role of actors, interests, particularly anti-immigrant parties. And so we are saying what's missing is an analysis of the role and effects of national institutions in shaping those goal conflicts. So by institutions, what we mean, we understand them in a kind of more politics, political science sense. Those are basically formal rules and regulations that structure how individuals act. And we focus particularly on 4 types of institutions: welfare systems, labor market regulations, legal systems, and political settings. And I'll explain a little more in detail what we mean by that. So basically, what we are trying to do is to understand how and why national institutions and the interests which are associated can shape the nature and response to this goal conflict and therefore affect the conditions of irregular migrants. So basically what we are arguing is that these different types of institutions, the characteristic of a labor market, a welfare state, or legal system, can weigh in on different sides of the conflict. They can favor either a logic of universal fundamental rights protections or a logic of differentiating policies with different groups of people. So kind of immigration control logic. And we basically say that institutions can have 3 types of effects. I mean, they can constrain national policy actors. So for example, a government might want to do certain things on immigration control, but then there might be a legal system, there might be constitutions, there might be rights protections that prevent the government from doing that. And the extent to how strong these constraints are varies across countries. So that's why you have to look at the difference in institutions. But the institutions also shape the interests of different actors within different countries vis-a-vis irregular migrants. So one question we're asking is, how trade unions, for example, think and behave vis-a-vis irregular migrants will depend on what kind of institutional context they're in. Are we talking about the relatively strong union in a highly regulated labor market, or are we talking about weaker unions in flexible labor markets? So interests are shaped through national institutions as well. So the contribution we want to make is basically to obviously contribute to research, understanding this why and how institutions matter. In terms of migration studies, we focus very much on the national. So there's been a lot of important research that focuses on the subnational or transnational. We say that it's very important to understand the role of national policies and national institutions in shaping individuals' outcomes. And from a policy perspective, basically, we're saying that if you want to understand effective common policy making, you need to understand the significance of institutional differences. So being an irregular migrant or the consequences of regularization policies are, does not mean the same, or they're not the same in Stockholm, in Rome, in London, or in Warsaw, precisely because of that institutional context. So how are we doing all of this? We're just to conclude briefly, we are studying how things vary across countries with different institutional settings. So we've picked our countries, specifically having those different institutional settings in mind, and we're analyzing. So what we're analyzing are rights on paper. So we have a strand of work that looks at the legal rights that migrant workers have in countries with different institutional contexts, including different legal systems. Obviously the conditions and experience of irregular migrants at work, but also the host countries. So we're looking at, like Tesla, we're looking at specific sectors, and we're looking at the reliance of employers on different types of migrant workers and other workers. How does that vary across institutional contexts? And also host country attitudes, public attitudes, and interests of specific groups. So for example, how do trade unions and employer associations formulate their interests and policy preferences with irregular migrants? Okay, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin, for highlighting this. And for also referring to this goal conflict, which is a very interesting kind of concept, I guess, in terminology. Kind of as you said at the beginning, it's on the one hand, for example, the conflict that could be between states who have clear policy priorities for controlling immigration, and then on the other hand, universal rights protection for all people on the territory. And then outlining kind of how you'll be looking at this with looking at the role of these national level institutions such as the welfare, the labor market, legal systems, political settings. One of the things that we have always found interesting from our work at PICUM is the issue of healthcare, and that there are 3 countries, Belgium, Italy, and France, that have had legislation for nearly 30 years, enabling some form of healthcare for undocumented migrants, which is way beyond emergency care. So that's just a very specific example, and probably I think your project also does address the issue of healthcare, I think if I remember correctly, a little bit more maybe than some of the others, and that will probably also come up. Very interesting that you have this legislation that's also continuously challenged, I should mention, in France. Almost each year it's questioned. But that is still part of the picture in addition to return priorities, etc. So how do these countries look at that? Will be very interesting to hear the findings as they progress from your project. We do have a couple minutes for any questions. And I'd like to now go to the Q&A question. So the first one was, I'll kind of group the questions and then ask the panel. So the first one was kind of talking about narratives. So frequently in public discourse, the terms undocumented and irregular migrants are used, but there might be some confusion regarding their precise meanings. So this is a question for anyone on the panel. Could you kindly elucidate the distinction between these 2 terms and provide guidance on their usage? Also another question, could you highlight any key strategies, projects, or effective policies implemented by EU countries that have demonstrated success in supporting undocumented migrants and their integration? Another question on ethnographic research, maybe for Nando. So I'd like to know more about the approach to carry out this research with migrant communities who typically remain invisible, but any of the others obviously can comment. How are migrants identified, approached, and how is the safety of the participants ensured? One for Martin. Can you develop more? Why is migration control of value, and why is it of equal weight to human rights, to absolute human rights? Also linked to that question, the human rights of undocumented migrants start from their human condition linked to human dignity. As human, that's also maybe for Tesselchen, because we had a whole discussion on dignity within Dignity Firm. As human dignity cannot be waived with any migration policy priority, is there really such a conflict? And last one for Martin, you've mentioned 4 types of national institutions. Which ones do you think play a role, national or non-national educational institutions, in shaping the goal conflict? So quite a few questions. We do have about 5 minutes left to answer. Probably a lot of food for thought as well. I don't know if anyone on the panel would like to begin, and Albert also, if you would like to answer any of these, please feel free. Would anyone like to start?
Maybe I have a take on the first question, the terminology, and well, ultimately I think that's a reflection of the many terms that keep on popping up also, and that there's never a really an ultimate fix or an ultimate concept that is the concept that one should use, and each of the concepts is a little bit a child of its time. And I remember when 10 years ago, the first EU institutions, and I think it was the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, adopting the term irregular migrants or migrants in an irregular situation, that was the framing that they used, was really seen as a progress compared to the predominant use of illegal migration and illegal migrants previously. But by now it also become flavored with some kind of migration control and a negative kind of connotation. So it has moved on, and that's why Nando is using ICLAIM is using irregularized migrants as a different alternative. So I just think that this shows that, you know, you always have to be sensitive to what you actually want to get at, and also what the specific context of a term is. And just to close this off, I think we have moved away from the term undocumented a little bit, because it's not necessarily the case that people don't have documents. They have a variety of documents. They might even have some kind of recognition of stay, like people whose return is suspended and who are sort of in an in-between situation between a legal status and irregular, unlawful stay. It raises some difficult connotations, but that of course is also the case with other terms. So it's always pros and cons.
Thank you very much, Albert, for answering that. And yes, indeed, there are many different variations now. I think the key message on terminology is usually to avoid illegal, anything with illegal work, illegal entry, illegal stay, illegal child, illegal person. Illegal is everywhere. So it's really trying to find different variations and to avoid the opposite, which is legal. So to talk about regular, let's very quickly go briefly now to everyone else, because we actually do finish right about 2. So I'm going to first hand it over to Nanda for any responses, and then Tassuja and Martin.
The point about the terminology is fundamental, but in a way, it's something that we are going to explore in our research on the perception of people. Because the point is, you know, I may say I don't want to use illegal, fine. The problem is the term, and I do a survey with a representative sample of the population. The term I'm going to use is going to shape the result of my survey massively in terms of what is the way that the people are going to recognize what I'm talking about. So what we're trying to do is actually, one of the experiments would be to use different terminology and see what kind of a response triggered the use of different terminology. And the other point is that it's also interesting to see how, from the perspective of the counter-narrative, the analysis on the narrative and counter-narrative, in some cases, it's really interesting to see how the actor use terminology, you know, in their campaigning. You know, some people will not use any term in order to create, if you enter into this from a faith religious mentality, I can completely bypass the narrative of the legal status. Everyone is human, everyone is equal. I talk of people on the move. I talk of, you know, if I use like the Joint Council for Welfare of Immigrants, people move as a title. It's very powerful. I don't say anything about the status. I'm actually trying to raise a point about the right to migrate. You may agree or disagree, but that's a narrative strategy. So this is something we're trying to do in the research, you know, to work around this idea of how the terms become part of the mobilizing strategies.
Thanks, Nando, for that. Tassuja or Martin, any quick points that you want to raise?
Yeah, I can, if I may, just briefly on the question that Odilia put in the Q&A on successful examples where these other policies are used. At least that's how I interpret your question. And the first what came to mind was actually a positive example in law, but that has not necessarily has results on the ground. And that's exactly what we're investigating is in the Employer Sanctions Directive, which is clearly about all the terminology that Michelle doesn't like, illegal employment of illegally staying workers, but workers. It explicitly gives them workers' rights, and it tears these two identities apart. You can be an illegal migrant, according to this directive, but as a worker, you have rights. And under either competition law or other fields of law, there can be sanctions to employers that do not respect these rights. So there's some contradiction there as well, but it is a positive example at the legislative level, yet as our research, I think, will show, is that it does not have the impact on the ground that we would wish it to have. So we are very much open if in the audience there's people who actually have such positive examples where either case law or through negotiations these have effect. We're happy to collect them. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, Tesselje, for making that remark, also to invite people to continue to exchange on this and follow up. Martin, any final points that you have on those various questions?
Yes, maybe just on the goal conflict. That's quite, so we do have a paper coming out of this in the next few months. I think it's important to be quite clear about this. So when we say that we look at goal conflicts, so I mean, they don't need to be of equal value. We're saying that, you know, if you look at European democracies, there are competing objectives that are in practice being managed, and these are based on values and interests. So as many of you will know, there's a huge literature on the ethics of immigration control and all of that. And typically most people would argue that the right to control immigration is grounded in the values of democracy, self-determination, and rule of law. This right is not without limits. There are special duties towards refugees and all of that. But in practice, all countries want to manage immigration, and they do that based on some normative principles, which we recognize. And at the same time, there are important values that can inform a universal protectionist approach. So human dignity, equality, again, rule of law can also be used to argue for equal protections. So we're not suggesting that by any way that these are kind of equal worth in any way. We're just saying that empirically, I think these objectives are built into all European liberal democracies in one way or another. And when governments make policies on these things, they somehow have to move within that space. And some governments, obviously, as we know, are very strong in immigration control and don't care much about rights. But still, there is some pushback they get from some institutions. So we think that it's very important to understand the dynamics of this goal conflict. And the two goals, in some ways, of course, are incommensurable. So I'm not speaking about a simple trade-off where a little bit more of this means a little bit of less of that. I mean, they're incommensurable, but there are two important goals that are grounded in conflicting values and conflicting interests. And basically, to understand the conditions of irregular migrants, we argue you have to understand the dynamics of these goal conflicts across different institutional contexts.
Thank you so much, Martin. And I'm sorry that we're actually over time. We had a very interesting set of questions that unfortunately we can't get to, but this discussion is ongoing. So we've put in the chat the information about the next webinar. It will take place on December 1st at the same time, so 1 to 2 p.m. I think Tesselje, you'll be also hosting that with Albert, with Miriam, and that one will look at migrant worker rights. So key discussions recasting the single permit directive, where we'll continue on a lot of these issues, but go more in depth on that particular EU directive that's actually being negotiated as we speak. Thank you to all of you for your interest. In the chat, you have the links to all of the projects. There's usually newsletters and things that the projects are proposing. So if you'd like to be in touch, please feel free to sign up for those. And I think there'll be other opportunities also to be in touch as well and to contribute. Thank you for your interest, and we look forward to continuing to be in touch about all of these projects. Thank you very much to the panelists and to Krems for hosting this.